and they found 49 countries, 500,000 people, that the individuals who consumed the most salt every single day had the best blood pressure readings and the most normal blood pressure readings. And all the individuals who consumed 3 times the amount the FDA tells you should consume salt every day, every person around the world that consumed 3 times that amount had better blood pressure readings than anybody who took the FDA readings. Now, they publish in the Lancet in the UK where you are. The Lancet is a medical journal. They publish the results of the study that the more salt someone consumes, the better their blood pressure is, and the lower their risk factors for stroke and heart attack become. When you just asked me why and who benefits from this lie, why would they tell us this lie? Did you see that when that was published by the Lancet, did you see who threatened the Lancet with pulling their funding if they publish that study and don't retract it? The American Heart Association threatened the Lancet and told them, you publish that study, we're going to pull all of your funding. You have to retract that study. All right, so the next question for you is, why would the American Heart Association be angry at a medical journal for publishing a study, largest one ever done in history, proving that salt intake, the more salt you eat, the lower your risk factor for high blood pressure, strokes, and heart attacks is? Why is that a threat to the American Heart Association?
Everything that guy said was completely wrong. He clearly either has no idea what he's talking about or is deliberately lying. I don't know. But all I know is what he's saying is just nonsense. He's not an expert. He's a retired chiropractor, acupuncturist, selling his alternative nonsense. And this is now a very common marketing ploy that we see a lot on social media. You know, if you have your snake oil clinic or product or whatever, you're selling something, invent some weird medical conspiracy theory about how they're lying to you about this, or this is a toxin, or whatever, scare people about something and say, then buy my product, right? That's what he's doing. But let's break it down a little bit. So first of all, let's look at the evidence of the relationship between salt and blood pressure. This has been researched for decades. It's actually pretty uncontroversial. It's very well established that in people who have high blood pressure, the higher their salt intake, the higher their blood pressure, right? And if they lower their salt intake, that will lower their blood pressure. There is a clear relationship, pretty much a linear relationship between salt intake and blood pressure in people who have high blood pressure. We also know that high blood pressure definitely is a risk factor for heart attacks and for strokes. That's uncontroversial. Where the evidence does get controversial and where the Lancet study comes in is, well, what's the case for people with normal blood pressure at baseline, right? If you have normal blood pressure, is salt still an issue? Should you still keep your salt to a minimum? Now, the American Heart Association and some cardiologists and some researchers, some scientists hold that the evidence shows that there's basically a linear relationship between salt intake and blood pressure throughout the blood pressure spectrum, right? Even if you're normal blood pressure, you still should keep your salt intake low to avoid developing high blood pressure. However, some experts say, well, definitely with high blood pressure, salt intake is an issue, but with normal blood pressure, we basically don't know. We just don't know. And partly because it's hard to research, right? It's hard to research because you can't do an experiment. You can't control how much salt people eat. People are outliving their lives, So for nutritional things in general, it's really hard to do controlled experiments. So we do observational studies where, in this case, they measure blood pressure, they measure salt intake, they track cardiovascular outcomes, and they make correlational studies. They correlate it statistically. Now, what the Lancet study was saying was that the Lancet study actually confirmed the relationship between salt intake and high blood pressure. So this guy's completely wrong about that. Even the study he is citing does not show that. He's completely misrepresenting the findings. It confirms the association between high blood pressure and salt intake. But it says at the low end, it's like a U-shaped curve where if you go too low in your salt intake, it actually can lower your blood pressure, not cause high blood pressure like he falsely says. It lowers your blood pressure and could actually be a risk factor for heart disease. It could be dangerous if your salt intake is too low. So they're basically saying, yes, if you have high blood pressure, you should lower your salt intake. If you have normal blood pressure, don't lower your salt intake. And that's different than the American Heart Association's recommendations. Now, why did the AHA criticize the Lancet study? Well, there are some perfectly legitimate criticisms of that study. First, their patient selection. They chose patients who had a very high risk of heart disease. And the criticism is, well, you can't generalize from that population to the general public. It's quite possible that people who already are at very high risk for heart disease have a low salt diet because they have heart disease. If you have heart disease and you go to your doctor, he's likely going to tell you, go on a low salt diet. So in other words, the heart disease may have been causing the low salt diet, not the other way around. Secondly, they chose a very problematic measure of salt intake. They measured just the urinary salt in the morning and extrapolated your 24-hour salt intake from that one urinary measure. You know, there's no perfect way to do it, but the method they chose was not great, and so that came under criticism as well. People also criticized their statistical analysis, saying that the U-shaped curve is actually an artifact of bad statistical analysis. So the AHA, the American Heart Association, had good reason to criticize the quality of that study. That study didn't prove anything, as this guy, again, falsely says. It just shows that, well, maybe it's not a linear relationship when you get down to normal blood pressure. Maybe it's more of a U-shaped curve. And we need more research, is I think the real bottom line answer there. But none of this calls into question the association between high blood pressure and high salt intake. This study supported that. That's pretty much an uncontroversial finding. Now, the guy goes on to then, of course, you have to create your conspiracy theory, right? Why is the AHA lying about salt and blood pressure? Because they're in a conspiracy. He basically goes on to say, well, they get their funding from the pharmaceutical industry. Really? Do they? I looked it up. They get 3.8% of their funding from pharmaceutical and biotech and medical device companies. So even if you said all of that 3.8% are pharmaceutical companies making antihypertensive drugs, it's not. But even if you did, that's just 3.8% of their funding. That's an insignificant amount of their funding. Are they going to compromise their reason for existing, their core mission to reduce heart disease because of 3.8% of their funding? It's ridiculous. Look it up for yourself. He also implies or says outright that the AHA threatened to pull its funding from the Lancet if they didn't retract their study. I couldn't find any evidence of that. What I did look up, though, was who funds the Lancet. The Lancet, as he says, it's a UK journal. Why would the American Heart Association be funding a UK journal? From what I could tell, they don't. They are not listed among the funders. The Lancet is published by Elsevier, right? That's a publishing organization. They get funding from lots of sources, none of which apparently are the American Heart Association. I also don't think that the Lancet or Elsevier would cave into pressure from an American organization about publishing a study. Now, whether or not the study gets retracted or not has to do with an analysis of the quality of the science, and that's been debated. Oftentimes, what scientific and medical journals will do is just debate the implications and what conclusions we can draw from a study. Only if there's like outright fraud or outright error, blatant mistakes, will they actually retract the study. In this case, it's more like, well, your patient population was problematic, your statistical analysis was problematic, your measuring technique for salt was problematic. That's not enough to get a paper retracted. That's enough to criticize the paper and debate it in the literature, but that's not something that we typically retract papers for. So the AHA wouldn't make that request. I don't see any evidence that they did. They're not a funder for the Lancet anyway. So this guy is basically just weaving a made-up conspiracy theory out of whole cloth to sell his snake oil. But nothing that he says comports with reality. Nothing.